worked as a rater on the translation exams, Chinese into English, almost every year since the exams were launched in 2007. And I thought today, I hope that I can share some of my observations that I've made over the years in the course of rating the exams and give you all some insight into what's going on in the rater's mind when they're scoring the exams. The standard for passing the exams is professional competency. What does that mean? It means that the examinees can produce translations of 2 texts in a limited period of time that would be of standard quality that's acceptable in the professional marketplace, either as is or with minor revisions. Subjectively, I think what many of the raters are thinking is this a translation that I would like to see from somebody on my team? If I were working with a team of translators and this translation were given to me, would it help our project, or would I be better off having done it myself in the first place? That's sort of the subjective level, but that's kind of, I think, where the cutoff point goes when determining the numerical scores in rating each passage. So who's able to achieve this standard? Looking back in the past years as a rater, my impression is the people who really knock the ball out of the park on this test, obviously they've had a lot of practice and a lot of training. What does training mean? Training could be formal training in one of the translation programs, or it could be on-the-job training. But basically it means practice with critical input from other translators, from editors, from mentors, from fellow translation students or colleagues. And so practice and critical input are the key things that allow people to pass these exams. When we're looking at the exam papers, I have the impression over the years that they fall into 3 major categories. And, again, there's this probably the very smallest group, because the passage rate is not real high in these exams, is people who clearly have that practice and experience. And the largest group seems to be people who clearly don't yet have enough practice and training and just need to keep on working. And then there's a smaller middle band of people who are sort of borderline. And I think probably that's the group that could benefit most by understanding a little more about what the raters are looking for. Often as raters we see these borderline exams and we wish we could say, hey, if you just approach this a little bit differently or tried a slightly different strategy. But fortunately the exams are anonymous, so we don't know and never will who we're rating on any given exam. So today this will give me an opportunity to speak to some of those perhaps people who fall into that category, and also people who are still in the practice and training phase. I think I can share some thoughts. So when we're rating these exams, the 2 large criteria we're looking at are accuracy and expression. And we're giving numerical scores to each passage in the source text, the original text. in the target text for accuracy and for expression. What does accuracy mean? Accuracy means capturing and conveying the meaning of the original without adding or subtracting to it, in a nutshell. And expression is everything else. Capturing the tone and the register of the original and conveying it in a manner that's consistent with the grammar, syntax, style, conventions of English. We're going to be taking examples from past exams today. LTTC will allow me to mine their database a little bit. The examples are all anonymous and they're small examples. Some of them I've redacted or edited just a little bit, but the points that I'm going to discuss are all exactly the way they were in the original exams. Just some of the context I've edited a little bit to make things clearer. But some of the examples are examples of what I consider very successful translations, and also some examples of more problematic translations. And those elements I've left intact as they were in the original exam papers. Now we're going to be looking at these passage by passage, and because of time and space limitations, obviously, that's kind of unfortunate because a translator should always be looking at each passage in the larger context. So I've just given one sample exam text here, which you have in the handout. The print may be a little small. If you have reading glasses like me, you might be able to read it, or you might want to just sort of scan it out. But we'll look at individual passages in the examples. And what I'd specifically like to talk about is some of the most common kinds of errors, and also some of the most, what I think are avoidable kinds of errors that end up being sort of borderline papers that often don't quite make the cut. And I'm going to try to go from the general to the more specific. So the first, most general category of common and yet avoidable errors, I think, are errors of register and tone. And we have some students in the audience, and we also have some professionals, and we have academics. So some of this will be very basic for many people here, but some are basic concepts that I think are worth reiterating for those who may not be familiar with them. So register and tone register refers to the level of formality and the sort of social position of language in the source text. So the register can range from formal to casual to intimate to even vulgar. And in these translation exams, because this is general translation, generally the register is going to be a fairly neutral register, which is somewhere in the range between formal and a little bit more casual. And examinees should take the register on board when they're reading the source text for the first time before they start translating. And tone goes hand in hand with register, but refers to the overall style and pitch. Is a text humorous? Is it academic? Is it breezy? Is it sarcastic? Is it ironic? And again, in these general translation exams, usually the tone is fairly neutral as well, but there will be slight variances in tone. So it's something that is very important to pay attention to in the source text, and also to be very careful with in your rendering of the source text. Now, we should talk a little bit about what is the job of the translator on these exams. In a professional setting, translators could be called on to translate closely, or maybe the client will instruct us to translate freely, or even to paraphrase or to rewrite. For example, if you're translating in the field of advertising, so in these exams, however, the job brief or the job description is to translate closely. That's sort of the default mode for translation. If you don't have instructions otherwise, you should be translating closely to the original meaning and closely to the original register and style. And when looking at the register, determining the register, what are we looking at? We're looking at things like word choice. In English, we have lots of synonyms. For example, you can say someone is insane, mad, touched, nuts, wacko. These are all synonyms. They mean the same thing, but the register and the tone established are very different. What are some other flags of register and tone? Use of contractions. If I say, you can't do something, you cannot do something, you may not do something, these are different registers of language. Also use of slang. This is a flag of a certain register. And so I'd like to look at a couple of examples of, first we'll look at some register and tone errors, and then examples where the examinees have gotten it right. In this passage, this is from the 2011 C text. It's called 魔幻时刻 Magic World. Actually, we're not required to translate the title, so there's no English title. 若全家能一起溯溪攀岩，一起面对困境与挑战，产生同心协力的感受，魔幻时刻也很容易此时浮现。So the register here, it's a fairly neutral register. Now, if you look at this whole piece, it's a fairly intimate topic about how parents can develop a better, closer relationship with their children. So there's a hint of intimacy, but essentially it's a neutral register. And in the translation, the translator is pretty much, there are quite a few problems actually with this particular translation, but I'm just going to look at the register issue. The translator has successfully kept a neutral register throughout, besides if a family can face the difficulties and challenges together to forge a sense of binding by wading through, etc. Until the very last, the translation of 此时浮现, jump out of the blue and say their hellos. And this is a very wild departure from the original register. He's the examinee has chosen not just one, but two figurative expressions, and very casual figurative expressions, to translate what's just a literal term, fuxian. So a much safer and more accurate and more correct in registered translation would simply have been to emerge or to appear. So this would be, I would say this would be a major error of expression. Another example of register and tone error. Here, you look, this is another passage from the same exam 2011C, and the tone is essentially the same in the Chinese. And the examinee has hit the tone about right until all of a sudden they go from the indicative mood into the imperative mood with exclamation points no less. Go on a nature's walk. Go on a hike to enjoy the birds chirping. Have a heart-to-heart. The tone is no longer the original author speaking in the sort of former tone, but now the voice is, it sounds like maybe your loving mother, or you know. So it's the voice is completely departed from the voice of the original. This is also a major expression error, and it's also a punctuation error, which is an expression error. When marking down, we would probably consider those one error. Here's an example of a passage from that 2011C exam where I think the examinee has really gotten it right. I've noticed that when parents and children take a relaxing stroll in the wild simply to enjoy the breeze and so forth, they've kept a nice neutral tone. They've used a contraction, but that's fine. It's, you know, it's still reasonably formal language, and actually the contraction there, I, adds a bit of the intimacy of the sort of subject matter. So, apart from errors of register and tone, probably the next largest, what I consider most avoidable category of errors that I've seen on these translations are errors of addition and omission. Is it ever appropriate for a translator to add or subtract from a text? Sure, but really only when there's a compelling reason to, because of maybe features of the targeted source language, or the context requires additions and omissions. But we'll look at a couple of examples to make it more concrete. Now, if we look at this text, this is from the 2011B exam. The topic is about dieting, and the argument was that trying too hard to diet or starving yourself isn't going to let you lose weight, but actually have a reverse effect. So if everybody would take a moment and look at the translation here, the phrase is underlined. Does anybody see any source for those in the source text? Again, we're doing, of course, Chinese-English translation, so I've reversed my order from Professor Li's. I've got the source text on the top and the target text, the translation on the bottom. I don't believe so. Everything that's underlined here, the translator came up with that completely out of thin air. The second phrase, and we start out with suyi. We have therefore in English. He's taking care of the suyi. And then we could come up with the conclusion, why? Why? The same thing in the state of, it's just empty filler. Now we're all aware of the fact that. So these additions, in and of themselves, just because so much material has been added here that's not in the source text, that's a major expression error. Okay? And not only is that a major expression error, but the translator has sabotaged themselves. They've shot themselves in the foot, because by adding this, in the course of adding this unnecessary stuff, they've also introduced other errors. We could come up with a conclusion. So originally this is in a straightforward point of view, and they've introduced the subjunctive tense here. So there's a tense here. Now we're all aware of the fact that this is also, in addition to an expression error, it's also a meaning error, because they're giving you information that's not there. So why don't sabotage, yourself? That's my message to translators who are thinking of taking this exam. Keep close to the source text and don't add unnecessary additional information. And then the flip side of errors of addition is errors of omission. We don't want to add to the meaning of the original. We also don't want to subtract from it. So this, another passage from the 2011C exam. This translation reads pretty well. relationship between parents and children are like money deposited in the bank, and that one should put in as much money as possible and use it when children enter adolescence or during the empty nest period. Expression-wise, the grammar, the syntax, the readability, that's all there. This would have been high score in expression, and it may still get a reasonably high score in expression, but as far as accuracy, they've left out 3 critical elements in one short passage. 把握各种机会，狂飙青春期，产生疏离感。None of these have any expression in this translation. So this is the kind of translator as examiners, when we see this paper, we wish we could talk to them and say, hey, read the original a little more closely. You know, go back and read it word for word. Word for word doesn't mean you have to put every word into the target text, but at least you have to account for every meaningful element of the original. And here's an example of what I consider a successful translation of this same passage. You'll see that the underlined elements that were omitted in the last translation are all present here. This is, just looking at this translation, we can tell this person who did this translation has had a lot of practice and training. There's no way somebody can come up with this kind of translation without a lot of practice and training. It's not a perfect translation, but there's no such thing as a perfect translation in the constraints of time of this exam. And actually, this translation is a little bit freer than I might recommend as an approach. But basically, they've gotten all the meaning elements and they've conveyed them in a style that's up to the standard of expression. So, 把握各种机会. A more literal translation would have been seize every opportunity, and that would have been fine. While you can, they sort of they've taken a very free approach there, but I wouldn't take any points off of that. It conveys the idea. Okay. And just to show that these examples aren't to say that you can't omit anything. If something carries no meaningful information or significance, then the translator does have discretion. And as an example, this is from the 2010 C exam about the magician Liu Qian, the Chinese magician. 对许多华人而言，讲到魔术师 the passage here, they've simply left 讲到 out, and that's fine. That's just verbal filler, basically. Likewise, the second passage from the 2010 D exam. 记得有一天一位成功的企业家请我吃饭. One day, a successful entrepreneur. That's fine. Had they said, I remember one day, that would be fine too. I think one day, leaving out the I remember is probably a little more elegant, but we're not going to take off any points, for either putting that there or leaving it out. Essentially, it's not germane to the argument. It's not meaningful information. If there were some theme of memory or nostalgia woven throughout this, then the jita might have more significance, but that wasn't the case here. Okay, another major problem area that I've seen as a rater on these exams is word choice. And word choice poor word choice can result in errors of both accuracy and expression. And it's also tied up with issues of register and meaning. And here we'll look at an example. This will be my only example today that's not from these exams. But this is something that I came across and I thought it really sort of brings out how even the smallest word choices can make a huge impact. This is alternative translations of the title of 陈水扁自传, 台湾之子. There's a published translation on the market, and the title of the published translation is The Son of Taiwan. And it occurred to me, well, in Chinese there's no article there, but in English we have to supply the article, or at least we have to think about supplying the article. Is it necessary or is it correct? So, looking at these three translations, it seems to me, especially the first and second, have wildly different implications. The son of Taiwan, it sounds like the chosen one. I am special, I am the chosen one. Almost have religious implications. A son of Taiwan. To me, that's completely opposite in feeling. It's one of many. salt of the earth. I'm one of Taiwan's many good sons. And now I haven't read this autobiography, and I don't know what the tone is, but I suspect it's probably not the first one. Even if it came across as the first one, I don't think that's what the author intended. And so I suspect probably A Son of Taiwan would have better conveyed the feeling. But be that as it may, these are the kinds of things we have to consider when we make our word choices in English. In this instance, if the son of Taiwan, he is the son of Taiwan, if that came up in the middle of the sentence, we would have to supply an article, either definite or indefinite, automatically in English. In a title, we have the luxury of considering just to leave it off and forget, and fudge it or evade the issue. Unfortunately, I think that's not the right way out either, because your readers are likely to take one or the other interpretation. So the translator really should be making that decision. Here's an example of some various word choices in translations by different examinees of one passage, again in the 2011 C examination, the 青春黄标期. If we look at the term, we'll look at 青春 and 黄标. 青春 has been translated variously here as puberty, adolescence, teenage phase. Now, for purposes of this exam, because this is a general translation exam, all of those would be passing scores. If we deducted anything, it would just be a little bit, but probably those are all acceptable in this context. If this were a technical translation exam, we would definitely deduct for teenage years, and we might deduct for puberty. What's the difference between adolescence and puberty? Puberty is 发生期. It's more of a medical or biological term. Adolescence is 青春期 is the period from puberty until onward towards adulthood, and it has more sociological or psychological connotations, which is closer to what the author of this article is talking about. Nevertheless, that wouldn't be a major error, I don't think, in this context. But it's the kind of thing that a really good translator will be thinking about when they make these word choices. And then the 黄标期, crazy puberty. The register may be a little bit off there. That would not be a major error. But taken together with the questionable word choice of puberty and crazy, there might be maybe a minor expression error. Troubled teenage phase, I think troubled is fine. Turbulent, fine. Tumultuous, these are all synonyms and they all capture the right register. The third translation is interesting. Here the translator has gotten clever. In the Chinese, 多贮存一些资产留待青春黄标期 for the rainy days when the adolescence storms. So that's maybe a little bit too jargony or slangy or almost overly clever translation. Nevertheless, if that's the only instance in this translator's work, I would not consider that a major error. Probably not even a minor error. However, if I notice that this translator has a habit of falling into this kind of jargon or being overly clever, then they're no longer conveying the original register and tone that we would consider marking down a minor error. And then the next one, those hormone-infused adolescent years. This is also really borderline. Hormone-infused, there's nothing about hormones in the original. And yet a reader can certainly associate to hormones because that's what puberty and adolescence are. It's when the hormones are raging and that's what causes the turbulence. So this would probably not be marked down because we hear that it's a collocation of phrase that we hear in this kind of context enough. Nevertheless, it's really borderline. I would think about possibly marking it down. So safer to go with a very neutral translation. Turbulent adolescence, tumultuous adolescence, troubled adolescence. Another thing that seems to trip up examinees is dealing with figurative language. There's not a whole lot of figurative language on these exams because they're general exams and they're taken from fairly contemporary popular material in a relatively neutral register for the most part. But there is some. Usually there may be one or two instances of figurative language in any given text. And here, also when we look at word choice, and when we look at how we're dealing with figurative language or using it or not, we not only have to, as translators, look at these things in the source text, but we also have to go through and reread our own translation and see whether we've used figurative language or literal language might have been more appropriate. So in this case, this is in an otherwise quite good translation. This would be a passing translation. This is also about the magician Liu Chen from the 2010 C exam. Liu has been working on a project that involves a man climbing literally out of a flat screen television. He said, no one has ever done this before. I've been having my mind on this for about 2 years now, and if I actually pull this one off, it will be absolutely mind-blowing, he added with a smile. This translator has pretty much caught all the major information and meaning elements of the original. There are a couple of errors of tense and small errors, but this would be a passing translation. However, the 毫无遮掩的直接爬出来, that's literal language, and he has used the word literally to translate this literal language, but ironically, literally here is not literal, it's actually figurative language. What does literal mean in English? When literally is used literally, it means that something is just as it is expressed. When it's used figuratively, and it's used figuratively a lot in English, it's used as an intensifier. Hey, did you catch that guitarist at the club last night? He was literally on fire. You mean they had to grab a fire extinguisher and put it? No, he was tearing it up. He was, playing really well. So, is it appropriate to use literally like that in this kind of translation? I've actually noticed this usage coming up a lot in these translations, and several examples that I was considering using just happened to be there. And it tended to be people whose English was quite good, although probably not native, but maybe near native, seem to lean towards this word. I'm not quite sure why. And I wouldn't make this wouldn't be a major error of expression here, but it would be, I think, something of a meaning error, a minor meaning error, borderline. What about just using literal language rather than the figurative meaning of literally and saying to climb straight out of an LCD screen in plain view? That would have been a much safer translation. And Liu Chen is not promising that he's going to make somebody literally, this is talking about stage magic, it's an illusion. Sometimes you'll see English nerds on campus wearing t-shirts that say, misuse of literally makes me figuratively crazy. Okay, this next example is some various translations of a passage with figurative language, in this case a metaphor, also about the magician Liu Chen. Liu Chen 是第一位踏上美国 Las Vegas Hollywood 在魔术表演圣地魔术城堡。表演圣地, this is a metaphor. And so when we were confronted with the metaphor, we have choices. Do we find a corresponding metaphor? Or do we use literal language to convey the same idea as the metaphor? And my take on this in this case would be if there is a perfectly appropriate metaphor, then use the metaphor. For example, in the first passage, the translator chose to translate it literally in the famous magic performing spot. He's captured some of the meaning, but not quite, because the original 踏上表演圣地, it sounds like a pilgrimage. It's like he's been aspiring to this, and other people aspire to go and see magic at this famous magic performing spot. So it would be nice if we could bring some of that resonance into the translation. And it's easily done because 圣地, probably any contemporary language, there's some corresponding metaphor. We can say Mecca, even the Holy Land is both, it's sort of on the borderline between literal and figurative. So either of those I would have considered a perfect translation, Mecca or Holy Land. The second, and famous magic performing spot, we wouldn't deduct, this wouldn't be a major error of meaning or expression, but I think it would be a borderline minor error. The second translator has used Holy Grail. That's an interesting choice, and I noticed a number of translators using this. It kind of leaps to mind because it has the holiness aspect. But the metaphor is a little bit off, because the Grail is something that's always been searched for and prized, but never found. But here the emphasis is, wow, Liu Chen was the first to actually 踏上表演圣地. So this metaphor, this also would not be a major error, but it would be, I think, a borderline minor meaning expression. And the third translation, the Mecca of the Magic World, I think that's a perfect translation. Some other translations that we saw, also literal, the sanctum, or the holy sites. Those are also close, but still they don't have that resonance of, they're a little bit overly literal. Another kind of figurative language, simile, tends to be a little easier to translate than metaphor because authors, when they use simile, which is a comparison using like or as, or often go on and elaborate on the simile, so they do some of the translator's work for them. In this case, also from the 2011 C exam, 亲子关系就像是一行存折一样. Here, it's figurative, but we can translate on the face of it. That's probably the most successful strategy to take here. And I prefer here probably the second translation, which is works like a bank account. Because whether you're talking about passbook or bank account or savings account, these are all the same idea. And in English, we'd be more likely, I think, to say works like a bank account. So all of these would probably be passive. Well, obviously number 2 would be passive. Number 3 would be passing. They would probably all be passing, except number 1 is a little bit off in expression. It just doesn't sound very natural in English. The passbook's issued from the back. So there's nothing about issued in the original. So. And then the final general category of errors that in here I'm inferring about how these errors are introduced, but I think they're errors that occur because the translator has not saved enough time for themselves or just is not in the habit of very, very carefully going through their work. This we saw earlier in the example of the errors of omission. These are very frustrating for examiners because we see these fluent, well-expressed translations, but then there are these sort of typos or omissions. In this instance, the translator has said, this again is in that 2010 11D article about dieting. 避免等到过度饥饿才吃. The translator says, don't start to eat until you can no longer take the hunger anymore. And if they had simply read with a cool eye their own work, they would have realized, wait, what I meant to wait here. So, what does that mean, reading with a cool eye? This is one of the most important attributes or competencies that a translator can have. I think in my experience over 20 years of translation, that what really sets apart the expert translators from the mediocre translators or the translators you don't really want to work with is that the excellent translators that you do want to work with are the ones who reread, and revise their own work. I can't possibly emphasize that enough. It's just a habit and a discipline that we have to cultivate. No matter how proficient we get and how automatically translation comes to us, just taking that extra time to reread at the end. And the time that's required to reread gets less as you progress, but you still got to take that time to reread every word in the source text, and then reread every word in your translation and make sure that everything that needs to be there is there, and nothing more. What do we mean by rereading with a cool eye? Ideally, as translators, we translate something, set it aside, for a couple hours or a couple days. If we're doing something like literary translation, you want to set it aside for as long as you possibly can. In our day-to-day translation work, we don't have that luxury. And obviously, in this exam setting, the examinees don't have that luxury. So the translator, in the course of practicing, you need to train yourself to read your own work with a cool eye. And how do we do that? It's kind of like you look at your good friend. Usually you're not really examining them, but you have to sort of change your mental framework and try to see them as if they were a stranger. And reading your own work in the heat of just having done it, it's like a warm friend. But actually, you've got to sort of say, okay, look at this text with a strange eye, with a cool eye. And I think if you just make a conscious effort to do that, you'll find that you can do it. It gets easier and easier the more you do it. So I've got a couple more examples here of passages that illustrate some other types of problems that we see in these translations. This is from the 2008 D exam, several alternative translations of this text about green architecture or ecological building. And the first, if we look 在生态方面维持现状往往比开发营造更困难。 绿建筑尽量保留原有的余地，同时善用植栽以美化景观，降温减碳。The phrase 维持现状. You see, the first translator has translated this as keep things in the way they are. The second and third translators have translated this as maintain the status quo. Actually, with this passage, I was kind of astonished to see anybody use anything other than maintain the status quo. Because in Taiwan, we so often hear 维持现状, maintain the status quo. They're bandied about in both Chinese and English that I expected to see everybody use that. But actually, if this were an article about cross-strait relations, then I would expect the translator to use the phrase maintain the status quo, but it's not. And so if anything, maintain the status quo is a bit of a cliche. So I wouldn't mark down for that cliche, but I'm perfectly happy to see keep things the way they are. The use of in here is a little ungrammatical in English, but the problem here with keep things the way they are is the translator put it in quotation marks. Why? No idea. So when do we use quotation marks? I mean, so punctuation is also a major trip-up area on these exams. And the translator needs to be thinking about how punctuation is used in Chinese and how it's used in English and how what on the surface seem to be corresponding punctuation marks are used differently, appropriately in the two languages. In this case, the translators just put these in out of the blue. Maybe they were concerned about their phrasing, and so they subliminally felt they needed to put it. So quotation marks in English, when do we use them? We use them for actual quoted matter, or we use them when something is being used by the author in a sense that's not necessarily the surface sense of that thing. So if you're talking about fresh vegetables in quotation marks, you might want to question whether these are the vegetables you want to buy, actually. In legal, my specialty now is legal translation, so we use quotation marks often to introduce terms that are being used in a defined way in a text that the author defines or the legislature defines, as it may be. Other common punctuation examples are things like the quotation marks or brackets that are used to indicate proper names in Chinese. In English, we often see the translators just sort of automatically turning those into quotation marks in English, but we don't need to, because in English we have capital, uppercase, and lowercase letters. So if I see a proper name in quotation marks and capitals, then I might make that a minor expression error for having quotation marks there when they don't need to be. Another issue with punctuation is Chinese douhao and English. What do they correspond to in English? They don't necessarily directly correspond to either commas or periods. It depends on the context. Chinese sentences, when I say sentence, I mean a full stop with a period, tend to be longer than English sentences. Sentence length is a whole other issue, but generally it's a good idea to keep your sentences short in your target language, although you can mix them up a little bit for rhythm and readability. But when you see the commas in Chinese, you need to think about, A, do I need a comma here in English, or do I need a punctuation mark here in English? And what's the appropriate one, a comma or a period? Semicolons are also used differently in Chinese than in English. In English, really, in most cases, the only time you use a semicolon is when you have two very, very closely, often parallel, independent clauses. So anyway, just something that this is something that translators should study in the course of their practice and be attuned to how punctuation is used differently in the two languages. Here, if we look at the second example, green architecture, the second sentence in the second paragraph. Green architectures preserve the original greenlands as possible as they can. Comma, in the meantime they make. That's a run-on sentence. So it's a punctuation error and it's a grammar error. Or a syntax error, rather. Okay, and then another area that is illustrated in these translations is the use of pronouns. In Chinese, pronouns are often omitted. In English, we often supply them. But pronouns are a common stumbling block for translators. So when rereading one's own translation, it's good to go and look at our use of pronouns and see whether does each pronoun have a clear antecedent. Do we know what this is referring to? Here, green architectures preserve the original greenlands as possible as they can. That they, what does that refer to? Well, I guess it refers to green architectures. If the translator is being careful in their reread, that might flag them to actually architecture is non-count. And if we're talking about abstract architecture here, then it would be okay to refer to it as something that preserves, but then we wouldn't use the pronoun they. Likewise, in the third example, in regarding to the ecology, it's more difficult to maintain the status quo than to develop and construct a new one. new what? The new status quo. So if the translator were paying attention to his use or her use of pronouns in the reading through, they might have called that and said, hey, I don't even need that phrase there. That's an unnecessary addition. We'll look at one more set of examples from the exams that illustrates also some common problems. This is from the 2009 exam about male pattern balding hair loss. 皮肤科陈医师就表示，门诊中常见有落发困扰的男性，因花了20万元做所谓的减法课程无效而前来就诊。So the first problem we see here is a problem with expressing figures, and this is something that is also very common stumbling block in these translations, dealing with numbers and dollar figures. Translators preparing for this exam should make sure they really have their numbers down pat, especially large numbers. 百万千亿千亿. Everybody should know these by rote because you don't want to be spending time fiddling with dictionaries, and they're not always the units that numbers are expressed in Chinese and English are kind of staggered, and so it's best to really have these down cold before you go into these exams. Here, the first translation has dealt with this very effectively. 花了20万元, $1 or $200,000. Perfect. It's a literal translation. The figure is correct. There's no reason to go anywhere else with that. The only problem here is that I would suggest that they put in New Taiwan dollars or NT dollars because this is a translation for an English reading audience. English reading audiences, there's always a risk they're going to, or likelihood, wonder, are we talking about greenbacks, US dollars, or are we talking about New Taiwan dollars? But otherwise, that's a perfect translation. The next translation spent thousands of dollars. Here we're off by a whole couple orders of magnitude. And the same with the third translation, spent $10,000 or $20,000. So the second one, the translator has taken an unnecessary, sort of unfounded liberty, and the third, they just got it wrong. Another issue is tense. If we look at the tense of the first translation, Dr. Chen said it's common to see patients who came to seek help. The tense is a little bit off there. I would say that's a minor error of expression. But otherwise, the first paragraph here would still be a passing translation. But the tense is a bit off. If we look at the second, dermatologist Chen states that many men with problems keeping their hair went to him because they had spent thousands of dollars. They went to him. Okay. He's kind of reading the tense in the original a little differently than I am, but actually it's a little bit vague in the original. And at least he's been consistent. He uses the past tense for something that happens in the past, and the past perfect had for something that happened before that. So we're not going to take any points off probably here. And the same thing with the tense in the third. It successfully uses who have spent and have come, using the present perfect tense. And then problem with literal translation, 剑法课程, the first 所谓的剑法课程, so-called hair enrichment treatment courses. Sure, perfectly acceptable translation. So-called therapies, it would have been nice if they put hair treatment therapies, although that omission is probably not a serious error because in context we know we're talking about this. And the third, hair health lessons. Hair health lessons, is that so? They're teaching you how to try to grow your hair back. It's not clear if this was a dictionary error or just the person didn't think about their word choice carefully. Okay, so here I've summarized both these sort of major kinds of errors that we commonly see and often feel like should be very avoidable on the exams, as well as just a checklist of other types of things that we as translators should always be going through as we check our own work and think about it in the course of doing our translation. Register and tone, readability and style, completeness, accuracy, word choice, no unjustified vagueness or ambiguity. Vagueness and ambiguity is a whole different topic in itself. It hasn't, it's something that translators need to be aware of. I don't have time to go into it today, but it's something that if you're not sure about treating that, it comes up a lot in our work in translation of legal documents. We see vagueness in the source text. We have to say, is that deliberate vagueness? Often it is. The legislature or the author of the contract wanted to leave themselves some room. Or is it accidental vagueness? And then the nature of the job we're working on will influence the way we treat that in the translation. You have to treat it consciously and make decisions about how to treat it. The syntax and grammar, this is especially important for translators who are working out of their native language into a vegan language, as we call it. Make sure the most common errors we see are agreements between subject, objects, and verbs, clear antecedents for every pronoun, no run-on sentences, no misplaced modifiers, appropriate tense and mood, pay attention to punctuation. These are all things that we all, no matter how long we've been translating, have to be checking for all the time. The longer you're translating, the more you internalize these things. But if you're still in the practice stage, then you should be thinking about them very consciously. And the administrators asked me to talk about resources for translation today. And to my mind, only two resources really count. And that's practice, 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 practice. Nobody's going to pass these exams if you haven't done a lot of translation. And just doing a lot of translation isn't enough. You have to, for some people it is. There's some people who just have that natural aptitude who manage to build themselves into good translators. But very rare, and most of us have relied heavily in developing ourselves as translators on critical input. If you have the luxury of enrolling in a translation program like NTU or Fugao or Taida, then you get great input from people like Liao Zhuren and Lai Laoshi. If not, you can find jobs like, for example, on editorial desks of newspapers in translation or translation agencies, where the important thing, though, is when you choose these jobs, find ones where there's a mentoring system or an editorial system. If you're doing translation freelance for a translation agency, that's a great way to get practice, as well as get paid while you're practicing. Make sure that when they edit your translation before it goes out, say, hey, let me see my translation after it's been edited, and then note what's been changed. You may not always agree with the changes, but at least you'll be seeing what somebody else saw they thought might benefit by changing your translation. So where to get practice and critical feedback. So I just discussed a bit where to get practice and critical feedback. And one other resource that I thought, concrete resource, might be useful for people preparing specifically for the Chinese English translation exam is Panorama magazine. It used to be called Cinerama, Guanghua Zazhi. The reason I recommend it, it's a Chinese English publication. The original articles are, for the most part, in Chinese, and then there are translations in English by quite experienced translators. I happen to know they translate as a team. They have a native Chinese editor who goes through for accuracy. So while the translations aren't perfect, the vast majority are well above the threshold for passing this exam, clearly above the threshold. So, and they're on a whole variety of topics that are very similar. You can search their database online for topics that are similar to the topics that will come up in this general translation exam. Now, if you really want to challenge yourself as a translator, of course, you can also look at translations of world-class literature by world-class translators and practice doing that. Tends to be literature. But for the nuts and bolts purposes of this translation, I think these translations from the popular media are useful. But make sure you go find high quality ones. Don't just find any translation that's online, because there's a lot of money translation online too. You could also go to bookstores. They have a great translation section if you want to learn a little more theory. Suji, they have one in Taipei, one in Taichung, one in Kaohsiung, I believe. But really, the practice is what it boils down to have a good shot at passing these exams. Okay, and Lai Laoshi, if I may go on just for a couple more minutes, preparing for the exams. I think preparing for these exams under the exam conditions, I know I can say with certainty that there are lots of excellent translators who've been translating for a long, long time, who if they were to sit down in the exam hall tomorrow and take this exam, they would not pass. Because actually translating is very different with the resources and the time and the luxury that we have in most professional content texts. Sometimes we do work under deadline. But translating these exams in this time frame in longhand is very different from what even those who've been doing it for years. I mean, we're wired, my brain is wired to translate like this. This kind of facilitates my thought process. Get me to write like this, it just throws a wrench in the gears. So to prepare for this exam, you really need to sit down and practice translating under these exam conditions to make yourself good. As far as which dictionaries to bring, the answer is the biggest one you can find. No. The answer is you have to try different dictionaries to find which ones work best for you, because examinees have different needs. Some people might benefit by having a dictionary that has usage styles, especially someone going into English is not their A language, would want dictionary that gives examples of usage. And other people may have other needs. So you have to really try various dictionaries and work out for yourself what's best. I think most of us who are translating in the professional context today really don't rely on print dictionaries much anymore. So all this text-taking environment is quite alien. And then the administrators asked me to talk about eating suya. So I'll just talk for 1 minute about this. I thought this was interesting, the term suya. I looked at that. What is suya? I mean, I kind of know what it means, but if you ask me to translate it, does it mean competencies? Does it mean attributes? So I wouldn't even try to tackle that right now, but I'll just tell you what I understand is I think a translator should have a professional attitude. Of course, they should be competent, which is all the things that we've discussed so far. They should be conscientious, and by conscientious I mean that's the approach to the job that you're doing at any given time. Is doing your best to meet the client's expectations or the goals you've set for yourself. For example, taking an exam or preparing. Meticulous is actually the process, going back and reading every word of the source text and reading every word of your translation and see whether you've really touched all the bases. And then finally, perfectionist, and perfectionism actually is a neurosis in some medical literature. Some translators often talk of ourselves as being obsessive compulsive. We need to be a little bit obsessive compulsive to be a good translator. There's some truth to that, but I mean this in the sense that may we all avoid being neurotic perfectionists, but strive to, even after, suppose we've passed these exams successfully, that doesn't mean that we're, the best translators yet, or the best that we can be. So we should always be striving to improve our translation skills and our translation quality of our output throughout our careers.